There were a range of female guards in Stutthof concentration camp who would work there and would bring suffering and brutality every day. Stutthof was a terrifying concentration camp that was situated to the east of the city of Danzig, and a range of women from the local area answered the call of the SS to go and work inside the camp. Some were keen on rising up the ranks of working for the SS and causing suffering, and others were motivated by money. Executions were carried out throughout the camp, and in total around 65,000 people lost their lives inside Stutthof. Towards the later stages of the Second World War, there would be executions of the guards that worked inside it, and some of these were carried out in front of around 200,000 people on a large hill outside the camp. Some of those that were executed on the large scaffold were female. One of them was a 22-year-old woman by the name of Elisabeth Becker, who at such a young age was executed and infamous for her evil within the camp. She was a young lady who would use her evilness to condemn individuals to death. But how was Stutthof's female brute put to death exactly? To support our channel, please ensure that you subscribe. Elisabeth Becker was born on the 20th of July, 1923, and she was born in Nudijk in Danzig. She was of German descent, and when the Nazis took power, she would then be a member of the League of German Girls. It was the sole girls' youth organization in Nazi Germany and the female wing of the Nazi Party. The young women's membership was mandatory, and at its peak there were over 4.5 million members. The BDM, as it was also known, would brainwash and indoctrinate girls into Nazi systems and ideologies, and they would also prepare them for their role within German society as wives, mothers, and housewives. That was what Hitler desired, women to have as many children for his Reich and empire as possible, who would then be loyal to the dictator and his party. The girls had to study Nazi songs and sing them. They had to do physical education, such as track and field. They would also go to enormous sports days. The League of German Girls would even discourage the girls from disobeying any rebellion against their parents, and they expected them to be more loyal to the Nazis than to their parents. Girls were also forced to serve a year of land service, where they would perform farm labor, and also in other capacities in order to demonstrate their loyalty to the Nazis. When the Second World War started, girls were instructed that the invasion of Poland was necessary as a punishment to those people who were subhuman. Their propaganda was exaggerated, and as a result several of the girls who were members of the group would desire a career within the Nazi Party's businesses like the SS and within the concentration camps. One case of this was Irma Grazer, who would become referred to as a beautiful beast, and participation within the League of German Girls would make her get kicked out of the family house. But she would be more devoted to Hitler than her own family. She would eventually become a member of the concentration camp workforce and become a well-known guard. Other girls would work in the German war effort as attendants and nurses in hospitals, and others even worked as anti-aircraft defenders, as searchlight assistants and flak assistants. Elisabeth Becker, according to statements, would be one of them at the age of 13, where she was extremely impressionable, and she would be a hardline Nazi, it is believed. It's safe to assume that her family would also be Nazis, but in 1938, when she was merely 15, she would go and work as a tramway conductor in Danzig, her hometown. In 1940, she also was then employed in different firms and companies, and she was also employed as an agriculture assistant. She was doing all her employment and work in her hometown of Danzig, and she didn't get too far from home and from family life. But then as the war started to turn against the Nazis and the Germans, and as there were no men from the local area to be employed in the concentration camps, the SS placed advertisements in local town and city centers to persuade German women to train as concentration camp guards. Many women from Danzig answered the summons, and one of them was Elisabeth Becker. She may have also been called to serve, being invited to serve in the camps, and may have had little else to occupy her time, but where she would serve was Stutthof. Stutthof concentration camp began following the invasion of Poland, and it was a camp where many Polish citizens would be imprisoned inside following the invasion. It became a concentration camp in 1942, and the original camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had 8 barracks filled with inmates. But then it was enlarged heavily, and a new site containing 30 new Baroque buildings was made, and also a crematoria and a gas chamber was added in 1943. This was to make sure that the execution of prisoners could take place as efficiently and as possible. 150 people at a time could be held in the gas chamber in the camp. Men made up most of the camp guards, but also some women who worked there. Women such as Irma Bielhart, Hertha Botha, and Jenny Wanda Barkman would go on to become notorious for their mistreatment of prisoners in Stutthof. But over time, there were massive shipments of women and men who were being transported out of camps like Auschwitz. The conditions were extremely brutal there, and dozens of thousands of individuals died of starvation and the disease epidemics that were raging through the complex. There were also executions conducted at Stutthof, and many dozens of prisoners were shot at the facility, with thousands of them being killed also within the gas chamber. But Stutthof prisoners would also be brutalized by the medical personnel, who would administer ill prisoners injections of phenol that would kill them, and the guards would also beat prisoners to death. The forced labor that the prisoners were compelled to perform was likewise atrocious, and the prisoners were provided with substandard rations for the labor that they were performing. Elisabeth Becker would gain a reputation as a sadistic guard in Stutthof, and though she was in her early 20s, many of the women being guarded by her would not even look at her eyes. She was a woman who was a devoted Nazi, and more specifically was part of the prisoner selections. Through this practice, there were doctors and guards who would pick out the weakest prisoners, and once chosen, were promptly sent to the gas chambers to be killed. Elisabeth did this on a daily basis, and her involvement saw many women and children being sent to be killed, and she was deciding who would live and who would be killed on a daily basis. A lot of the female guards were taken to court at the conclusion of the Second World War, and they would be sentenced as a result of the things they did in the selections. Becker, however, kept working in Stutthof as a guard until she escaped and fled on the January 15, 1945. She feared that she would be taken by the enemies, but some of the guards who took prisoners on death marches would kill the former prisoners. Becker had only been at Stutthof for about 4 months, and she was sent back home in January of 1945. 3 months later, however, she was arrested by the Polish police, and she was subsequently imprisoned to stand trial. She was a defendant at Danzig in the first Stutthof trial, and this was to punish the guards who worked at the complex. Along with Elisabeth Becker, 5 other women appeared before a judge, one of whom was Jenny Wanda Barkman. Numerous witnesses were summoned to testify, and they testified that Elisabeth was one who was showing brutality in front of other prisoners, and was associated with the prisoner selections who were sent to their deaths in the gas chambers. Elisabeth Becker was subsequently sentenced to death, and she would at her trial admit sending a minimum of 30 women to the gas chambers and be executed. Following her death sentence, Elisabeth Becker subsequently penned multiple appeals to the Polish president for mercy in the form of letters, and the court then, in considered lessening her death sentence to 15 years imprisonment, as her offenses were less severe compared to the offenses of other women, such as Gerda Steinhoff and Jenny Barkman. But Elisabeth Becker had also worked at the camp for the shortest duration, but the Polish president would not pardon her, and together with the other convicted guards, Elisabeth Becker was paraded in front of a huge crowd and executed on the 4th of July, 1946. Biskupia Gorka was where the Stutthof guards were executed. This was a massive hill, and on this stood several gallows, massive wooden execution platforms where the guards were to be hanged on. On the hill stood 200,000 people who had come to observe the events. Elisabeth Becker was escorted out with the other guards, and she was then instructed to climb onto a truck in which several executioners and officials were stood on. One of these then read out the death sentence, and the preparations were made as the truck was backed up under the gallows. After an executioner assisted Elisabeth onto a step, the noose was tied around her neck, and a rope and noose were tied around the gallows. All the final checks took place, and after this the truck drove off, and Elisabeth was left on the scaffold and on the gallows, and within minutes she was executed and declared dead high above the huge crowd. Elisabeth Becker on the day she died was only 22, but she was a woman who had shown a lot of cruelty and brutality to people who were suffering. She was a woman who killed at least 30 women, and she was seen choosing many people to be sent to their death in the gas chambers. Even with the appeals for mercy, she was a brutal guard considered to have been brainwashed by the Nazis through her education and the youth groups she was coerced into joining. Although she was a war criminal too, and her actions cost other people their lives, and that is why the Polish court believed she had to die. 200,000 saw her die that day on the hill in Dabrzy Swigods.